The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle's ancient stones, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the simple black pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana. Today would be different from any other day in her decade as a member of the royal family. Today, she would witness her husband carry a burden that no son should ever have to bear. Prince William moved through the corridors of Windsor with measured steps, his military training evident in his posture despite the weight of grief pressing down on his shoulders. The past few days had been a blur of protocols, arrangements, and the constant presence of cameras documenting every moment of their family's most private sorrow. Yet through it all, Catherine had been his anchor, the steady presence that kept him grounded when the enormity of losing his grandfather threatened to overwhelm him. The Duke of Edinburgh had been more than just a grandfather to William. He had been a mentor, a source of unwavering strength, and one of the few people who truly understood the complexities of royal duty. When Philip had taken his final breath just days before his 100th birthday, something shifted in the very foundation of the Windsor family. The man who had walked behind his wife for over 7 decades, always 2 steps back but never wavering in his support, was gone. Catherine remembered the phone call that changed everything. She had been in the kitchen at Kensington Palace, helping Charlotte with her homework, while Louis played with his toy cars on the floor. The shrill ring of William's secure phone cut through the domestic tranquility like a blade. She watched her husband's face change from curious to concerned to devastated in a matter of seconds. No words were needed. She knew. The days that followed tested every aspect of their relationship and their roles as senior royals. There were endless meetings about funeral arrangements, guest lists that had to be dramatically reduced due to pandemic restrictions, and the delicate balance of honoring a man's incredible legacy while managing the nation's grief. Through it all, Catherine watched William struggle with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel publicly. She had seen him cry only a handful of times in their relationship, when his mother's memory overwhelmed him during quiet moments, when their children were born, and when his father had been diagnosed with cancer. But this grief was different. It was the kind of loss that fundamentally changed a person, the kind that marked the end of one chapter and the frightening beginning of another. The night before the funeral, William had found Catherine in their private sitting room, staring out at the London skyline. The city sparkled below them, millions of people going about their lives, unaware that tomorrow they would witness something extraordinary. He sat beside her without speaking, and she reached for his hand instinctively. "I keep thinking about what he said to me," William finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "The last time we spoke properly, he told me that duty wasn't about sacrifice, it was about service. That the crown wasn't a burden if you carried it with the right people beside you." Catherine squeezed his hand tighter. She understood the weight of those words, the responsibility they carried. Philip hadn't just been speaking about royal duty in general, he had been preparing William for the day when he would step into an even greater role, when the support system that had sustained the monarchy for generations would shift entirely to his shoulders. The morning of the funeral arrived with an unseasonable chill. Catherine dressed carefully, each element of her outfit chosen with precision. The black coat dress was elegant but not ostentatious, the hat perfectly positioned, the jewelry meaningful but restrained. She had learned over the years that royal mourning was as much about what you didn't wear as what you did. As they prepared to leave Kensington Palace, she watched William help their children understand what was happening. George, at 7, grasped the solemnity of the occasion, his young face serious, as his father explained that great-grandpapa had gone to heaven. Charlotte, 5 and always observant, seemed to sense the deeper currents of emotion flowing through the adults around her. Louis, still just 3, was thankfully too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of the day. The decision had been made that the children would not attend the funeral, a choice that Catherine knew was difficult for William. He wanted them there, wanted them to be part of honoring the man who had been such a significant presence in their young lives. But the restrictions, the formality, and the intense media scrutiny made it impossible. Instead, they would stay with their nanny, safe from the cameras and the weight of national mourning. The journey to Windsor was made in relative silence. Catherine sat beside William in the back of their official car, watching the familiar English countryside roll past. She could feel the tension radiating from her husband, could see the way his jaw tightened whenever he thought about what lay ahead. The funeral would be unlike any royal funeral in modern history. Small, intimate, and yet watched by millions around the world. As they arrived at Windsor Castle, Catherine was struck by the eerie quiet. Normally, royal events were accompanied by crowds, fanfare, and the constant hum of activity. Today, the ancient walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a bubble of solemnity around the proceedings. She could see the careful positioning of cameras, the precisely planned routes, and the small gathering of family members who would be allowed inside the chapel. Standing in the quadrangle, Catherine felt the full weight of history pressing down on them. This was where Philip had spent his final years, where he had walked the corridors as a young naval officer courting the future queen, where he had raised his children and watched his grandchildren grow. Now they were here to say goodbye, to honor a life lived in service to something greater than himself. She looked at William and saw her own reflection in his eyes, the recognition that they were part of something both incredibly personal and profoundly public, that their private grief would be shared with a nation and a world that had loved and respected the Duke of Edinburgh. In that moment, she understood that whatever happened next, whatever emotions the day would bring, they would face it together, just as Philip and Elizabeth had faced everything together for more than 7 decades. The bells of St. George's Chapel began their solemn toll as the small procession formed outside the castle. Catherine stood with the other royal women, watching as William took his place behind the coffin alongside his father and uncle. The sight of her husband in his military uniform, his face a mask of controlled grief, made her chest tighten with emotion she couldn't afford to show publicly. The Duke of Edinburgh's coffin, draped in his personal standard and topped with his naval cap and sword, seemed impossibly small for a man who had loomed so large in their lives. Catherine remembered the first time she had met Philip officially. How intimidating his direct questions had been, how his piercing blue eyes had seemed to see right through any pretense. Yet, as their relationship developed, she had come to understand his dry humor, his genuine interest in people and causes, and his absolute devotion to duty. As the procession began its slow march toward the chapel, Catherine found herself studying William's profile. She could see the rigid control he was exercising over his emotions, the way his military training was helping him maintain composure when every instinct probably told him to break down. This was the man she had fallen in love with at university, strong, determined, carrying responsibility far beyond his years, but today that strength was being tested in ways she had never witnessed before. The chapel itself felt both intimate and overwhelmingly significant. Only 30 people were allowed inside due to pandemic restrictions, making the space feel simultaneously too empty and too full of emotion. Catherine took her seat, separated from William by protocol and COVID guidelines, and felt the strange loneliness of grieving in public. She could see him across the aisle, could see the subtle ways his composure was beginning to crack, but she couldn't reach him, couldn't offer the simple comfort of her presence beside him. The service began with familiar hymns and readings, but Catherine found herself watching William more than listening to the words. She had witnessed him at countless royal events over the years, had seen him deliver speeches, meet dignitaries, and carry out the endless duties that came with his position. But this was different. This was personal grief made public, private loss shared with a watching world. When the Dean of Windsor began reading from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven," Catherine saw William's hands clench slightly in his lap. She knew those words were hitting him particularly hard. Philip had often spoken about seasons of life, about the importance of knowing when to step forward and when to step back, when to lead and when to follow. The Archbishop of Canterbury's eulogy painted a picture of a man who had lived multiple lives: naval officer, consort, father, grandfather, and constant supporter of the Queen. As he spoke about Philip's willingness to take the hand he was dealt in life and make something meaningful from it, Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time that day. She thought about William's own hand, dealt at birth, the weight of future kingship, the loss of his mother at such a young age, and now the passing of one of his most important mentors. But it was during the singing of the naval hymn, "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," that Catherine witnessed the moment that would stay with her forever. William's voice, strong and clear at the beginning, began to waver on the lines, "Oh, hear us, when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea." His grandfather's naval service, his love of the sea, his final journey, it all came together in those words, and Catherine could see her husband's careful composure finally beginning to crack. The moment she had been unconsciously preparing for throughout the entire service was approaching. As the coffin was lowered into the royal vault, as the final prayers were said, William stood rigid with grief that demanded acknowledgement but couldn't be publicly displayed. The cameras were recording every second, the nation was watching, and royal protocol demanded dignity above all else. It was then, as they filed out of the chapel into the bright April afternoon, that everything converged into a single moment of human connection that transcended protocol, publicity, and expectation. William, walking ahead of her in the formal procession, stumbled slightly, not physically, but emotionally. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his head tilted just slightly downward, in the almost imperceptible shake of his hands. Without thinking, without considering the cameras or the consequences, Catherine reached out. Her black-gloved hand found his for just a moment, a touch that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but contained within it everything they couldn't say aloud. Love for the man who was struggling with loss. Understanding of the burden he carried not just today, but every day. A promise that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The touch was subtle enough that most observers might have missed it, but profound enough that those who saw it understood immediately what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a wife comforting her husband. This was a future queen supporting her king, a partner acknowledging that some moments in life are too significant for protocol, too important for restraint. William's response was immediate and telling. His shoulders straightened slightly, his breathing steadied, and when he looked back at her, just a quick glance that the cameras caught, she could see gratitude mixed with the grief in his eyes. In that instant, Catherine understood that her role in his life had evolved beyond anything she had imagined when she first fell in love with a university student named William Wales. The rest of the day passed in a carefully orchestrated series of family gatherings and private moments, but that single touch remained the focal point around which everything else revolved. Later, as they returned to Kensington Palace and the business of royal life resumed, William would tell her that her hand had been exactly what he needed, at exactly the moment he needed it most. "I felt him leave," he would say quietly that evening as they sat together in their private sitting room, the children finally asleep upstairs. "During the service, I could feel Grandpapa actually leaving, and I panicked for a moment, thinking about everything I still wanted to ask him, everything I needed to know about being the kind of man he was." Catherine would remember her response for years afterward, how natural it felt to voice what she had been thinking throughout the entire day. "You already know, William. He taught you by example for 38 years. The man I touched today, the man who honored his grandfather with such dignity. That's exactly who Philip raised you to be." The photograph of that moment, Catherine's hand reaching for William's in his time of need, would become iconic in ways neither of them expected, not because of its technical quality or composition, but because it captured something rarely seen in royal life: genuine human emotion, unguarded and real in the midst of the most formal and public circumstances imaginable. The days following Prince Philip's funeral brought an unexpected quiet to royal life. The intense media coverage gradually shifted to other news. The formal condolences were acknowledged, and life began its slow return to the patterns of duty and responsibility that define the monarchy. But for Catherine and William, that moment of connection outside St. George's Chapel had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate comfort it provided. Catherine found herself thinking about the touch repeatedly in the weeks that followed. She had acted purely on instinct, responding to her husband's need without consideration for the watching cameras or the potential for misinterpretation. Yet the more she reflected on it, the more she understood that her response had been shaped by years of observing royal life, of understanding the unique pressures William faced, and of recognizing the moments when human need superseded protocol. The photograph appeared in newspapers around the world, usually with captions that focused on the compassionate gesture of a wife supporting her grieving husband. But Catherine knew the image represented something more complex and significant. It was a visual representation of how their partnership had evolved from a university romance into something that could sustain the weight of future kingship. In the private moments between public engagements, William shared with her how profoundly his grandfather's death had affected his understanding of his own role. Philip had been the last direct link to the monarchy of his childhood, the man who had helped shape his father and who had offered him guidance on navigating the unique challenges of royal life. Without that steady presence, William felt both more vulnerable and more responsible than ever before. "I keep hearing his voice," William confided to Catherine during a quiet evening at their Norfolk home, Anmer Hall. The children were in bed, and they sat together on the sofa that had become their refuge from the pressures of public life. Not in any mystical sense, but remembering things he said that I didn't fully understand at the time, about duty, about marriage, about the difference between being important and being useful. Catherine understood the weight of those memories. She had witnessed countless interactions between William and his grandfather, had seen how Philip's direct manner and practical wisdom had grounded William during difficult periods. The Duke had never been effusive with praise, but his approval, when given, carried enormous significance. Now William was navigating royal life without that compass, and Catherine realized that her role as his partner had fundamentally shifted. The touch outside the chapel had been more than comfort. It had been an acknowledgement of a new phase in their relationship. Catherine was no longer just supporting William through the normal challenges of royal life. She was helping him process the reality of moving closer to kingship, of accepting greater responsibility for the institution they both served. The Queen, in one of her rare moments of personal conversation with Catherine, mentioned the photograph several weeks later during a private tea at Windsor Castle. "It reminded me of something Philip once told me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of more than 7 decades of marriage. "He said that the monarchy survives because it remembers that we are human beings first, symbols second. What you did that day honored both aspects of your roles." Those words stayed with Catherine long after the conversation ended. She began to understand that her instinctive gesture had somehow captured the essence of what modern royal life required: the ability to maintain dignity and protocol while never losing sight of fundamental human connection. The touch had been photographed and shared globally, not because it was scandalous or inappropriate, but because it was genuinely moving in its simplicity. As spring turned to summer, Catherine noticed changes in how William approached his royal duties. He seemed more confident in his own judgment, more willing to trust his instincts rather than constantly seeking approval or validation. The loss of his grandfather had forced him to step more fully into his role as the heir's heir, but it had also freed him to define that role in his own terms. Their children, too, seemed to sense the shift in their parents' relationship. George, always observant, asked his mother why she and his father seemed to talk more seriously than they used to. Catherine tried to explain, in terms a 7-year-old could understand, that sometimes sad things happen that make people grow closer together, that sharing difficult feelings makes relationships stronger. The anniversary of Philip's death arrived with surprising gentleness. Rather than the sharp grief Catherine had expected, the day brought a sense of continuation, of lives moving forward while carrying the best parts of what they had lost. William visited his grandfather's grave privately, while Catherine took the children to place flowers at a memorial garden they had helped create in Philip's honor. That evening, as they sat together in the same room where they had processed so much grief a year earlier, William took Catherine's hand deliberately, consciously. "I think about that moment sometimes," he said. "Not the sadness of it, but how natural it felt to reach for you, to know you would be there." Catherine squeezed his hand in response, understanding that they were both thinking about more than just that single touch. They were acknowledging how their partnership had deepened, how their understanding of their shared future had crystallized through the experience of loss and mourning. The young couple who had married in Westminster Abbey more than a decade earlier had evolved into something stronger and more essential, partners who could sustain each other through the unique challenges of royal life. The photograph of that moment outside St. George's Chapel had become, in many ways, a defining image of their relationship. Not because it showed them at their most formal or regal, but because it captured them at their most human. It demonstrated that even within the constraints of royal protocol and public scrutiny, genuine love and support could find expression. As they prepared for bed that night, Catherine reflected on how much their lives had changed since that April afternoon. William had grown into his role with greater confidence. Their children were developing their own understanding of their unique positions, and she had found her own voice as a senior member of the royal family. But perhaps most importantly, they had proven to themselves and to the watching world that their partnership could weather the storms that royal life would inevitably bring. The touch that had lasted only seconds had communicated something that words could never have conveyed, that love, properly understood, was not just an emotion, but a commitment to stand beside someone during their most difficult moments, regardless of who might be watching or what the consequences might be. Years later, when historians write about the reign of King William V, they may point to many moments that defined his character and his approach to kingship. But those closest to him will remember a single touch outside a chapel in Windsor, when his wife's hand found his at exactly the moment he needed it most, proving that even future kings are, fundamentally and importantly, human beings who need love, support, and the simple comfort of knowing they are not alone.